Today I'm bringing you a video on the most controversial fitness influencer in the world. This person's name is Dr. Joel Seedman. Doctor is a very important distinction here. He did get his PhD from the University of Georgia, and he trains players across all different sports, NFL, MLB, NBA, and he gets them doing stuff like this, and like this. And of course, this makes him go viral on social media, gets him a whole lot of detractors and reasonable amounts of people supporting him. I'm going to dive into exactly why. Is there merit to this style of training? What are his philosophies? And what do I think of them? His dissertation was essentially using a movement that was 4 seconds down, 3-second pause, explosive concentric movements. And he took a group of people, he did that style of training and found that people got more powerful. Essentially, his dissertation was that power training makes you more powerful. Newsflash. The reason that I focus on Doctor, and frankly so does he, is because people, I think, have a misunderstanding of education. And when you do an undergraduate degree, you have an expert in the field leading you through, guiding you through textbooks, research, readings, to learn about topics. As you ascend the educational ladder, as I have as well, you learn less and less, and you're just trying to discover things. So if anyone has more than a master's degree, it's because they're going into the research side, not really into the application side. Now, the reason that is important is because you don't become an expert at all things. In this case, he has a PhD in kinesiology. He does not become an expert in all things kinesiology. Could you become an expert by researching a whole bunch of things? Absolutely. But the distinction itself doesn't mean that you've researched every individual area. It simply means I researched one small, very, very, very minutiae small area, and that was accepted by professors. That was defended successfully. That means I got my PhD. When I look at PubMed, Google Scholar, all of the databases of published studies, really, he only comes up once when he did his dissertation. This could be a limitation in my findings, but he's certainly not a well-published author outside of the one dissertation that he had. Now, in terms of his training, he's never powerlifted, but he's got a lot of opinions on powerlifting movements. He says a lot of things like, fix your body mechanics, you're going to ruin your gait, and I'll tell you how in a second. And he and Zach Tellender actually agreed to swap training methods. Now, generally speaking, Joel Seedman's training philosophy is only 90-degree training. Every joint only to 90 degrees. So it's not even a half squat. It's basically a quarter squat. A bench press would go from here to about here. You'd be maybe a foot off your chest, and that's it. And he claims that this is better for joint health, better for strength, better for virtually every training outcome. And that's another red flag. If someone says anything is better for virtually every outcome, they're almost 100% misguiding you. Now, Zach Tellender and him, they agreed to swap. Zach loves full range of motion. Joel Seedman obviously hates it. And Zach committed, he made content, and Joel Seedman could hardly do a full squat and quit after a week. Now, I believe he's doing weird things for social media views and clicks. I think if you actually went into his gym, he wouldn't be focusing on these extraordinarily strange things that he puts out on social media. But then I think he hides behind his PhD for credibility to then say that this is actually the optimal way to train. And that's why someone like this grinds my gears. It overcomplicates training to the nth degree. It makes people feel like they're going to get hurt just by going in and exercising regularly. And that's the last thing that I want to do. That's why I started the Lift Heavy Be Kind brand. The merch shop is in the description, but I want people to feel as comfortable, as open, as welcome, and as encouraged to the gym as possible, and understand there are way more right ways to do things and wrong ways to do things when it comes to training, especially at first. If you go in and you put in a reasonable effort, it's going to be safer than virtually any other recreational sport. It's going to be effective and you're going to see results. Now, he also does a lot of screaming and grunting when he trains, a lot of barking. I don't know why. That's my number one gym pet peeve. In summary, this guy's basically a gym fail compilation who has a PhD. Now, I'll talk about a few of his sort of core principles published on his website. They're just blogs on his website. And the first is a squat stance deadlift. He says this is the most efficient for everyone, that it's going to be the lowest injury risk, and this is how everyone should start. And the reason is because he says toes turned out ruin your hip mechanics and gait pattern. This is major red flag for me. Anytime any exercise professional talks about gait pattern, it's nonsense. I don't believe in any way someone could just look at how you walk and they can identify any sort of problems. And this has been borne out in the science. This isn't just a me thing. This is a literature thing. They take these experts who say that they can do it. They put markers on people. They have them walk. You can't even really tell. Next, he says, activating your feet and ankles properly will make sure your hips are engaged. Yes, this is true to an extent. Engaging your feet can help to make sure your hips are engaged, but engaging your ankles is a pretty irresponsible way for an exercise professional to be describing something, because you can't activate a joint. A joint can't be activated. A joint is simply there to articulate. You have to be activating some sort of muscle to be able to have any sort of function. Really, he promotes a narrow sumo stance with forward-facing feet with your hands, I believe, on the inside. Regardless, inside or outside, I think this is fine. This is a totally fine way to deadlift, and you can give it a try yourself. But I think it's dumb to say this is the definitive best way when deadlifting. If I try something like this, I find the pressure in my low back is just way too much for me to tolerate, and I prefer a much more narrow stance to this. Now, stepping it up to his sort of core belief that 90-degree training is optimal, we're going to focus on the squat here. So he says there are negative joint ramifications to training full range of motion, that there's an inflammatory response, that tightness occurs, that gait deterioration occurs when squatting to full depth. And he talks about scientific principles a lot in isolation, but not a lot in practice. For example, he says it's supported by in vitro studies, which means that you're taking something out of whatever you're studying and looking at that individually. In this case, it would be probably something in a petri dish or something like that. But as Lane Norton said, quote, "Do you have a line of cells squatting in a petri dish?" There's no way to have an in vitro study that would replicate how squatting to 90 degrees would be better or not better. Now, in terms of the negative joint ramifications, inflammation, tightness, this is just nonsense. It has more to do with the total cumulative load, volume, intensity that you're demanding of yourself, how well you're recovering, not just what degree range of motion you're going to. And frankly, if you're not training to be able to replicate what you do in life, then it's going to be pretty useless. So the depth that he promotes squatting to is not even deep enough to squat onto a toilet. I'm going to get to something extremely absurd in a second. But if we're not squatting to at least the depth of a toilet, think about your 60s, 70s, 80s onwards, you're not going to build that strength. He talks a lot about to 90 degrees or a quarter of the way down is your active range of motion, and any further down is your passive range of motion. But anyone who squatted heavy knows that when you're down at the bottom, you are still maximally engaged. You're not just sitting there hanging out. You are ready to fire. Now, here's a couple of quotes I took off his website. Quote, "As highlighted by the previous sections, the parallel or 90-degree squat," which his squats are nowhere near parallel, nowhere even close, represents a movement where key principles foundational to neurophysiology, skeletal muscle physiology, motor learning, and biomechanics are congruent with each other. This is just trying to talk over your head. Whenever you start just throwing around good, big blanket terms and you don't actually narrow down on what are you actually talking about, I start to get very skeptical. I don't see how a 90-degree squat would be best for neurophysiology, or 90-degree squat would be best for skeletal muscle physiology. In fact, the primary drivers of muscle growth, according to Mike Israetel, are mostly intensity and range of motion. So even skeletal muscle physiology, don't know what you're on about. Motor learning, well, you're learning to squat to 90 degrees, which is good if you're trying to squat a quarter of the way down, but it's not great if you're trying to squat all the way down, which I'll get to this now. This is absurd to me. He says, "I have trained a number of powerlifters, and not squatting to competition depth doesn't matter because you can just practice it for a few weeks before the meet." I've never heard a more irresponsible comment in my whole life. You can just practice it a few weeks before the meet. You don't actually need to train that way. Well, you wouldn't know what your numbers are. And then talk about not having control in the bottom of a squat. If you never trained there, how could you ever have control down there? Another quote here, quote, "With this in mind, it's no coincidence that parallel or 90-degree squats is the ideal squat method for humans, as the concepts involved are not based on man-made rules, but instead predicated on scientific principles that remain constant from human to human. Unless you're from another planet, there's no reason to think your body functions differently." You are the one making the 90-degree squat rule. That's that's a man-made rule. I don't think God or whoever the hell made us thought 90 degrees is the goal. And if we look at an evolutionary perspective, well, they are sitting on their heels. And you can argue they're sitting there passively, but to get up from that, then they're not getting pulled up. They also have to stand up from that squat. So, yeah, it could be passive at times. It could be active at times. I don't understand any part of how 90-degree squats or quarter squats, because 90 degrees parallel is certainly an inaccurate representation of how he promotes squatting. I don't see how that is ideal. Now, whenever I see someone squatting a quarter of the way down, my mind first goes to, well, they can only use their anterior chain, because really a quarter squat is a closed chain knee extension. You're not really getting a whole lot of engagement of any sort of glutes, hamstrings, even spinal erectors, core, because you are staying very, very upright compared to a normal squat, because you don't need to hinge over at all. And if you don't hinge, we're not using posterior chain. If we're not using posterior chain, well, we're back to activating the ankle, activating a joint, which is impossible, but activating the foot is to engage the hips properly. Well, the hips work best when we are hinged over, and you don't need to hinge over to quarter squat. On top of the fact that the bottom of a squat and the very top of a squat is when something like your VMO is going to be most active. I don't particularly believe that it's going to make your knees healthy, but I don't think it's going to make it unhealthy either. So, don't understand. Last, eccentric isometrics are king. This isn't even a term. Something has to be eccentric or it has to be isometric. We can't just slap the words together and call that a new form of training. Now, what he is referring to is a 4-second eccentric followed by a 3-second hold, isometric, and explosive up. That's because that's exactly what he did in his dissertation, and he found positive results among one group of people. Is it likely to cause increased power in everyone? Yes. Is normal eccentric and fast concentric likely to increase power in everyone? Also, yes. I've never seen a study where he's actually compared one to the other, compared his style of 4 down, 3 hold, and explode up to just simply lower down and explode up. To control for 4 seconds, hold for 3, and explode up, you'd have to use such a relative light load that all you're really going to build is power. You're not going to build a whole lot in terms of strength. And you're really only going to develop power in small ranges. I think it's absurd to say that you're building power in ranges that you never train, because you're not going to build the motor units to be able to use those muscles in those ranges you're unfamiliar with. This is just the principle of specificity. If you want something to get better, you have to train it in that range in a similar fashion to be able to get the benefit. Now, when he talks about inflammation, one of the most inflammatory responses to exercise is to eccentric training. Eccentric is disproportionately inflammatory, disproportionately damaging to the muscles, and he promotes more of that. Now, it doesn't cause that much inflammation because, like I said before, the load has to be so low that there's no way that it's going to cause that inflammation or muscle damage. But inherently, eccentric movement, if you're looking to limit inflammation and damage, you should limit your eccentric training. That's why if you ever see me deadlifting or any high-level strongman deadlifting, we don't slowly lower the bar to the ground because we don't want that eccentric damage. In other words, a lengthening of the muscle under load is incredibly damaging and very difficult to recover from. We also have to put some caveats on this style of training. It's not possible for anyone with glaucoma, with uncontrolled blood pressure issues, with any sort of cardiac issue to focus on eccentric and isometric training. So just as a blanket statement, we can't give this as advice. Last, and this is very weird, he doesn't believe in the stretch shorten cycle with lifting. He talks about powerlifters and how they drop slowly. Well, they sort of drop slowly if they're equipped or if they're in wraps. Well, why? I assume he's never been equipped or never been in wraps, but because you have to stay on balance so much. And when the load gets really heavy, if you try to descend and ascend quickly, you're going to get off groove. So they're going slow to stay on groove, not to activate the stretch shorten cycle better. Now, for those who don't know, the stretch shorten cycle is something like when you do a counter movement jump, where you sort of drop before you jump up. That's why you can lift, that's why you can jump higher than if you just did a standing jump, or sorry, a jump from a chair. Because every muscle, when it stretches, has a neural response to contract, because we want to keep our muscles healthy. We don't want to stretch them too far. And when they contract, that on top of conscious contraction, if you time that well, that can be extremely, extremely powerful, and it's very useful. And we see this in Olympic lifters. We see this in raw power lifters. We just don't see it when we're equipped lifting. So I don't like to just give my opinion and contrast that with someone else's opinion. He doesn't have a huge amount of evidence behind what he's talking about, other than his one dissertation that he really likes. Of course he would. It got you a PhD. Now, I have 4 studies here. The first one is very simple. It is partial versus full range of motion training, a systematic review and meta-analysis. And in the results, it says here, subgroup analysis suggests there may be a muscle hypertrophy benefit to partial range of motion training at long muscle lengths compared to using full range of motion, i.e. exactly the opposite of what he's saying. If you train only the stretched portion, only the bottom of a squat, the hypertrophy results are going to be superior. Overall, our results suggest that using a full range of motion may enhance results for most outcomes: strength, speed, power, muscle size, body composition. Differences in adaptations are trivial to small. As such, partial range of motion resistance training might prevent an efficacious alternative for variation in personal preference, or where injury prevents full range of motion resistance training. But we're talking about the opposite range than he's recommended, the lengthened range. So it sort of says that the differences are small, granted, but they're small when we compare training only at stretched to training full range of motion, indicating that the most valuable part of your training is in that stretched position. The next study I have is effects on range of motion on muscle development during resistance training interventions. Again, a systematic review. And in the abstract here, it says, when assessing the current body of literature, it can be inferred that performing resistance training through a full range of motion confers beneficial effects on hypertrophy of lower body musculature versus training with a partial range of motion. Exactly the opposite of what he's trying to say. The third study here, resistance training leads to range of motion improvements, because one of his arguments is that training in a shorter range of motion somehow improves your range of motion, because you're not so sore and your joints aren't so damaged from training full range. And in this study, it says resistance training increased range of motion with the exception of no significant range of motion improvement with resistance training using only body mass. Meaning that as long as you're using load and you're using a normal range of motion, you are going to increase your range of motion. That being said, if you're only using body weight, it's not enough for resistance to be able to cause a physiological change to improve range of motion. Well, why? Here's my hypothesis, my education, my background. If we train to full range of motion, the interesting thing is when you stretch and when you increase your range, you're not actually changing the muscle itself. You're changing the neural relationship with that muscle. We're not adding on muscle fibers. We're not adding on sarcomeres. It's as simple as your neural connection to that muscle is allowing it to relax a little bit more. And the only way you're going to allow it to relax is if you train it in a stretched position. Now, I believe train in a stretched position with a low level of muscular damage, and that's going to signal to your body that it is okay, safe, and strong to be in those ranges of motion. I see no evidence whatsoever that training in shorter ranges of motion is going to cause better range of motion gains. And lastly, he talks about injury, and he talks a lot about, he seems to not understand the systemic response of inflammation, the local response of inflammation, but that's a whole different topic. But here I found a study about the injury risk factors associated with weight training, literally titled that exactly. And the conclusion of this study is that there are 3 primary predictors of resistance training injury. One is your age, one is the load, and one is the volume. Now, load regulated to the relative intensity for yourself, but load, age, volume, that's it. That's what you need to be concerned about. And if you want to get your training on point, I have that sorted for you. My programs are in the description, also in the pinned comments. My goal is to stop this nonsense. Stop people like this guy who are famous on Instagram for putting out really strange things, get some traction, then get some athletes because they have traction, and then they have authority because they have athletes coming to them. But their principles are not based in science. They're not based in truth. They're not based in any sort of logic other than This is a great marketing ploy to try to be different than other people. Do not succumb to people like this. Do not listen to people like this. Follow for entertainment, follow for a couple of laughs, but don't take this as gospel, please. That is my #1 priority, is to try to drop the barrier of exercise, to make everyone feel welcome, everyone feel like the gym is a place for them. And it's not that hard to get started. There are more right ways to do things than wrong ways to do things. Short range of motion, that's okay if you're first starting and you feel more comfortable, that's fine. Full range of motion if you're first starting, that's fine. If you're looking to be competitive in powerlifting and strongman in any strength sport, you must train full range of motion. You must not cut exercises short. It's sort of just 101. Any reasonable powerlifting coach would tell you that, which he is not. He's not a powerlifting coach. He's not a strongman coach. He's not a physical therapist. He's just a guy who did a dissertation on traditional power training and found that it made people more powerful. I'd love to know your guys' thoughts. Go ahead, pop them in the comments. As per usual, lift heavy, be kind. This is not in any way hatred towards the guy. This is just putting out information accurately. It grinds my gears when people just mislead others for the sake of their own marketing ploys, the sake of their own profits. And that's that. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you want me to do more like this, let me know. Pop a moose dropping in the comments if you have nothing else to say, which is just a little period to help the algorithm along, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we will catch you tomorrow.